They found little Michael Peterson face down in the creek behind his mother's apartment on a Tuesday morning in July 1987. The water was barely 2 feet deep. I was the social worker assigned to his case 3 months before he died, and I carry his death certificate in my purse even now, 38 years later. The paper has gone soft as fabric from being folded and unfolded, read and reread, as if repetition might change the words typed across it. It never does. Cause of death, drowning. Manner of death, accident. But I know better. I knew better then, and I did nothing. I'm 85 years old now, living in a retirement community in Cherry Hill where the hallways smell like disinfectant and the dinner bell rings at 5 o'clock sharp. My daughter visits on Sundays and tells me I need to let go of the past, that I did my best, that you can't save everyone. She doesn't understand that I'm not haunted by the ones I couldn't save. I'm haunted by the one I chose not to save, because saving him would have meant admitting I was wrong about his mother, wrong about my judgment, wrong about everything I'd built my career on. The other residents here think I'm dwelling in grief when they see me sitting by the window with that death certificate. They pat my shoulder and offer me butterscotch candies from the bottoms of their purses. But I'm not grieving. I'm remembering. I'm forcing myself to remember every detail of those 3 months, every sign I ignored, every excuse I made, every time I chose my pride over a child's life, because the lesson I learned from Michael Peterson came too late for him. But maybe, just maybe, telling this story now might save some other child from a social worker like the one I used to be. I spent 33 years in Child Protective Services in Newark, New Jersey. I started fresh out of Rutgers in 1969, full of textbook theories and a certainty that I could spot a bad parent from across a room. I believed in my training, my instincts, my ability to read people. I prided myself on never being fooled, never making mistakes, never letting my personal feelings cloud my professional judgment. I retired in 2002 with commendations, awards, and a reputation as one of the toughest, most discerning social workers in the state. Everyone said I had a gift for knowing which families could be salvaged and which children needed to be removed immediately. What nobody knew, what I barely admitted to myself until Michael died, was that my gift was really just stubbornness dressed up as expertise. I didn't want to be wrong. I couldn't afford to be wrong. So when the evidence started suggesting I'd misjudged Diane Peterson, when the signs started pointing toward danger, I did what I'd been trained never to do. I looked away. The case file landed on my desk on April 14th, 1987. I remember the date because it was my birthday, my 51st, and I'd planned to leave early for dinner with my husband, Arthur. Instead, I stayed late reading about 4-year-old Michael and his mother, Diane, who'd been reported by a neighbor for leaving the boy alone while she worked double shifts at a diner in East Orange. The neighbor, a Mrs. Kowalski, claimed she'd heard the child crying for hours, that she'd seen him wandering outside in his underwear at dusk, that something wasn't right in that apartment. I scheduled a home visit for the following Monday. I'd done thousands of these visits by then, and I thought I'd seen everything. Drug houses where needles crunched under my shoes, homes so filthy the roaches scattered when I knocked. Parents who looked at their children with such emptiness that I wanted to scoop those kids up and run. But I'd also seen poverty that looked like neglect but wasn't, exhaustion that looked like indifference but wasn't, and fear that looked like hostility but wasn't. I believed I could tell the difference. Diane Peterson's apartment was in a complex off Central Avenue, one of those 1960s brick buildings with rusted railings and parking lots full of potholes. I climbed 3 flights because the elevator was broken, my briefcase heavy with blank forms and my mind already half decided about what I'd find. The door opened before I could knock, and there stood Diane, 27 years old with Michael hiding behind her legs, peeking out at me with eyes the color of creek water. She invited me in immediately, no hesitation, which I took as a good sign. The apartment was clean, not spotless, but clean enough. Toys were scattered across the living room floor, bright plastic shapes that looked well used. The kitchen smelled like pine sol and coffee. Michael wore faded but clean clothes, and when Diane sent him to play in his room, he went without protest. Everything in my training said this was a tired single mother doing her best, not a neglectful parent endangering her child. Diane sat across from me on a couch, covered with a Mexican blanket, and answered every question I asked. Yes, she'd left Michael alone a few times when she couldn't afford a babysitter and couldn't miss work. Yes, she knew it was wrong. But what choice did she have? Michael's father was gone. Her own mother had died 2 years ago, and the women she'd paid to watch him before had stolen from her. She cried when she talked about it, the kind of tears that seemed genuine, that made her mascara run in black streaks down her cheeks. I should have been suspicious of how perfect it all was, how rehearsed, but I wasn't. I was relieved, because if Diane was a good mother in a bad situation, I could close the case with a warning and some referrals to child care assistance programs. I could go home and tell Arthur that I'd helped a family stay together instead of tearing them apart. I could add another success to my mental tally of cases resolved without removal. Michael came back into the room while we were talking, carrying a stuffed dog with one ear missing. He climbed onto the couch next to his mother but didn't cuddle against her the way most 4-year-olds would. He sat separate, watching me with those watercolored eyes, and something in his stillness made my chest tighten. I asked him if he liked his stuffed dog, and he nodded but didn't speak. Diane laughed and said he was shy around strangers, that he'd warm up eventually. I should have talked to him alone. That was protocol. But the apartment was small, and Diane seemed so cooperative, and I'd already decided this was a poverty issue, not a safety issue. So I skipped it. I made a note in my file that the child appeared healthy and appropriately attached to his mother, and I moved on to discussing resources. I gave Diane a list of sliding-scale daycare centers and told her I'd check in by phone in 2 weeks. She thanked me profusely, walking me to the door with her hand on my arm, telling me I was different from other social workers, that I actually cared. I believed her because I wanted to believe her, because believing her meant I was good at my job, that my instincts were sound, that my 33 years of experience meant something. Pride is a quiet poison. It doesn't announce itself. It just seeps in slowly until you can't tell the difference between protecting your judgment and abandoning your duty. The first follow-up call went to voicemail. So did the second. On the third attempt, Diane picked up and apologized breathlessly, saying she'd been working so much, things were crazy, but everything was fine. Michael was great. She'd enrolled him in a home daycare down the street, and the woman who ran it was wonderful. I asked for the daycare's contact information, and she promised to get it to me, but she never did. I should have insisted. I should have driven over there unannounced. Instead, I made a note in the file and told myself I'd follow up at the 60-day mark. Mrs. Kowalski called the hotline again 6 weeks after my first visit. She reported that the crying had started again, that she'd knocked on Diane's door multiple times with no answer, that she'd seen Michael sitting alone on the apartment stoop at 9 o'clock at night. The call was assigned to me, and when I saw the name, I felt a flash of irritation. Some neighbors couldn't mind their own business. Some neighbors saw problems where there weren't any because they were lonely or bored or prejudiced against single mothers. I'd seen it 100 times. I called Diane instead of visiting. She sounded harried but explained everything. Mrs. Kowalski was a bitter old woman who'd complained to the landlord about Diane's visitors, her music, her very existence. The crying Mrs. Kowalski heard was probably the television. Michael loved cartoon shows with dramatic music. The night on the stoop, Diane had stepped out to get her mail, and Michael had followed her. 30 seconds. Tops. As for the daycare, that hadn't worked out. The woman had closed suddenly. But Diane's schedule had improved, and she was home with Michael most evenings now. Every explanation was plausible. Every explanation was exactly what I wanted to hear. So I closed the second complaint as unfounded and made another note in the file. I didn't tell my supervisor that I'd skipped a home visit. I didn't mention that I still hadn't verified the daycare situation or spoken to Michael alone. I just filed the paperwork and moved on to the 30 other cases on my desk, each one screaming for attention, each one pulling me in a different direction. Looking back now, I can see what I couldn't see then. I wasn't busy. I was hiding. Because somewhere deep down, beneath all my rationalizations and explanations, I knew something was wrong. I knew it the way you know when the phone's about to ring, when a storm's coming, when you've left the stove on even though you can't remember doing it. But acknowledging that wrongness would have meant admitting I'd been fooled, and I couldn't do that. My reputation was built on never being fooled. The final call came on July 21, 1987, at 7:43 in the morning. I was eating toast in my kitchen, still in my bathrobe, when the phone rang. It was my supervisor, Ellen, and her voice had the careful flatness it got when she was delivering bad news. A child had died. My case. Michael Peterson. Found in the creek behind his apartment complex. Mother claimed he'd wandered out while she was sleeping. Police were investigating. I needed to pull the file immediately and prepare for a review. I don't remember hanging up the phone. I don't remember getting dressed or driving to the office. The next clear memory I have is sitting in a conference room with the file open in front of me, reading my own notes, seeing all the places where I'd written "mother cooperative" and "child appears healthy" and "situation improving." The words looked like they'd been written by a stranger, someone naive and careless, someone who had no business being responsible for children's lives. The investigation took 3 weeks. Neighbors reported that Diane had been leaving Michael alone for increasingly long periods, sometimes overnight. The home daycare story was fabricated. The address Diane had given me didn't exist. The boy had been seen multiple times wandering the apartment complex, once trying to cross Central Avenue by himself. Mrs. Kowalski had called the hotline 4 times total, not twice. 2 of those calls had been assigned to other social workers who'd closed them based on my initial assessment that the home was safe. The creek where Michael died was a place he'd been found playing before. Other children went there too, drawn by the water and the trees, and the illusion of wilderness in the middle of Newark's concrete sprawl. It was shallow enough to seem harmless. But a 4-year-old who slipped on the algae-covered rocks, who fell face first into the current, who had no adult watching him, no one to pull him out. For a child like that, 2 feet of water was enough. The official conclusion was that I'd followed protocol inadequately, but that no criminal negligence had occurred. I received a written reprimand and was required to undergo additional training in risk assessment. Diane Peterson was charged with child endangerment, pled guilty, and served 18 months. The file was closed. Everyone moved on. Except I didn't move on. I couldn't. Because every time I closed my eyes, I saw Michael's face, those creek water eyes watching me from behind his mother's legs, trying to tell me something I refused to hear. I saw myself sitting in that apartment, so certain of my judgment, so proud of my ability to see through false reports and vindictive neighbors. I saw the person I'd been, competent, experienced, unshakable, and I wanted to scream at her, "Look harder, ask more questions, stop being so goddamn sure of yourself." Arthur tried to comfort me. He said accidents happen, that Michael might have died even if he'd been in the best foster home in the state, that I couldn't have predicted everything. But he was wrong. It wasn't unpredictable. It was predicted. Mrs. Kowalski predicted it. The other neighbors predicted it. Probably even Diane predicted it, in whatever part of her mind wasn't consumed by exhaustion or addiction, or whatever darkness had made her incapable of keeping her son safe. I was the only one who didn't predict it, because I was too invested in being right about my initial assessment to see what was actually happening. I'd built my entire identity around my judgment, my experience, my ability to read situations accurately. And when the evidence started contradicting that identity, I chose the identity over the evidence. I chose myself over Michael. The months after his death were the darkest of my life. I stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night. I lost weight until my clothes hung loose on my frame. I started seeing a therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Reeves, who specialized in professional trauma. She helped me understand that what I was experiencing wasn't just grief. It was a complete collapse of the narrative I'd built about who I was and what my work meant. For 33 years, I'd thought of myself as one of the good ones, a social worker who actually cared, who could tell the difference between real danger and poverty, who saved children instead of punishing families. But Michael's death revealed the truth. I cared more about being right than about being thorough. I cared more about my reputation than about a child's safety. I was willing to ignore warning signs if acknowledging them meant admitting I'd made a mistake. Dr. Reeves asked me once what I would have done differently if I'd known Michael would die. The answer was obvious. Everything. I would have visited unannounced. I would have insisted on speaking to Michael alone. I would have verified every single thing Diane told me. I would have treated Mrs. Kowalski's calls as credible until proven otherwise. I would have recommended removal at the first sign of continued unsupervised time. I would have erred on the side of caution instead of on the side of my ego. But the real question wasn't what I would have done if I'd known he'd die. The real question was why I needed to know he'd die before I'd do those things. Why wasn't the possibility of death enough? Why wasn't the responsibility I'd been given enough? Why did I need the worst-case scenario to actually happen before I'd take it seriously? I went back to work after 6 weeks. My supervisor suggested I take more time, but I couldn't stand being home alone with my thoughts anymore. The first few cases were torture. Every mother reminded me of Diane. Every child reminded me of Michael. I second-guessed everything, saw danger everywhere, recommended removal in situations I would have previously considered salvageable. Ellen called me into her office after I'd pushed for emergency custody in 3 consecutive cases. She closed the door and sat across from me, her hands folded on her desk. "You're overcorrecting," she said. "I understand why, but you can't work from a place of fear. You'll destroy families that don't need to be destroyed." I wanted to argue with her, but she was right. I was so terrified of missing another Michael that I was seeing Michaels everywhere. I was removing children who would have been fine with proper services and support. I'd swung from the arrogance of certainty to the paralysis of doubt, and neither extreme was helping anyone. Dr. Reeves and I worked on finding a middle ground. She helped me develop a new framework for assessment, one that wasn't based on trusting my gut or protecting my ego, but on systematic verification. Document everything. Speak to the child alone, always. Trust the neighbors until given concrete reason not to. Follow up in person, not by phone. When in doubt, err on the side of safety, but don't mistake fear for doubt. It was slower, more deliberate, more exhausting. It required me to accept that I didn't know everything, that my experience wasn't infallible, that being wrong was part of the job. It meant letting go of the identity I'd spent 3 decades building and becoming someone more humble, more careful, more willing to admit uncertainty. The change didn't happen overnight. For years after Michael's death, I struggled with the balance between overreacting and underreacting, between seeing danger everywhere and missing it entirely. I made mistakes in both directions, but I never again skipped a home visit because I was too busy. I never again took a parent's word without verification. I never again let my need to be right override my obligation to be thorough. I retired in 2002, 15 years after Michael died. By then, the guilt had softened into something else. Not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance. I couldn't change what had happened. I couldn't bring Michael back or undo the arrogance that had made me blind to his danger, but I could make sure that every child I encountered after him benefited from the lesson his death had taught me. In my 15 remaining years of work, I encountered dozens of cases similar to Michael's: exhausted single parents, concerned neighbors, plausible explanations. And every single time, I remembered that small boy with creekwater eyes, sitting so still on his mother's couch, watching me decide his fate. I remembered how certain I'd been, how wrong I'd been, how deadly that certainty had become. Some of those cases resulted in removal. Some resulted in intensive services and supervision. A few resulted in criminal charges against parents who, like Diane, were incapable of keeping their children safe. But all of them, every single one, resulted from a systematic, humble, thorough investigation that prioritized the child's safety over my ego. And while I can't know for certain, I believe some of those children are alive today because I learned to doubt myself. Arthur died in 2011, 13 years ago now. Lung cancer. He never smoked a day in his life, but the cancer didn't care. In his final weeks, when the morphine made him nostalgic and philosophical, he told me he was proud of how I'd changed after Michael. He said most people would have quit or broken completely, but I'd found a way to transform tragedy into purpose. I held his hand and thanked him, but privately I wondered if purpose was enough, if anything could ever be enough to balance the scales. Our daughter, Jennifer, visits me here every Sunday. She brings her kids sometimes, my grandchildren, who are teenagers now and barely tolerate the retirement home smell long enough to give me a hug. Jennifer knows about Michael. I told her the story when she was in college, studying to be a teacher. But she doesn't understand why I still carry the death certificate. She thinks it's morbid, unhealthy, a sign that I'm stuck in the past, but I don't carry it as punishment. I carry it as a reminder. Because the lesson Michael taught me isn't just about social work or child protection or professional responsibility. It's about what happens when we become so invested in our own expertise that we stop seeing what's right in front of us. It's about the danger of certainty, the necessity of doubt, the lives that get destroyed when pride trumps humility. I see it everywhere now, even here in the retirement home. The doctor who dismisses a patient's symptoms because he's already decided what's wrong. The nurse who skips the safety check because she's done it 1,000 times before. The family member who insists their loved one is fine despite obvious signs of decline. We all do it. Build our identities around our competence, our experience, our ability to know better than others. And when reality contradicts that identity, we choose the identity. Last week, a new resident moved in across the hall. Her name is Patricia, and she has a daughter who visits twice a month, always with excuses for why she can't stay longer. Patricia tells everyone how devoted her daughter is, how busy, how successful. But I've heard Patricia crying at night. I've seen the bruises on her arms that look like finger marks. I've noticed how she flinches when I mention calling her daughter. The old me would have minded my own business, would have assumed I was overreacting, reading too much into normal family dynamics, would have told myself that Patricia's daughter probably is devoted and busy, that bruises happen when you're elderly and your skin is thin, that crying at night is just part of getting old. But the new me, the me that Michael created, can't do that. So I mentioned my concerns to the administrator. I documented what I'd seen in a letter. I offered to talk to Patricia if the staff thought it would help. I did what I should have done for Michael. I spoke up, even though I might be wrong, even though it might be nothing, even though it's easier and more comfortable to mind my own business. The administrator investigated. It turned out Patricia's daughter was stealing from her, taking money from her accounts, and emotionally abusing her when Patricia questioned it. Patricia is now working with a lawyer and a new financial advisor. Her son, who lives in California and didn't know what was happening, has stepped in to help. The daughter is no longer allowed unsupervised visits. I don't know if I saved Patricia's life. The situation wasn't as dire as Michael's, but I know I listened when she needed someone to listen. I know I acted when I could have ignored. I know I chose humility over certainty, doubt over assumption, responsibility over comfort. That's the lesson Michael taught me, the one I learned too late to save him, but just in time to save others. We are all fallible. We are all capable of being wrong. And the moment we forget that, the moment we become so certain of our judgment that we stop questioning it, we become dangerous. I'm 85 years old. I've lived through wars and recessions, the deaths of parents and husband and friends, the slow erosion of everything I thought I knew about the world. But nothing has shaped me more than those 3 months in 1987 when I let a 4-year-old boy die because I was too proud to admit I might have been wrong. Sometimes I imagine an alternate timeline where I did everything differently, where I insisted on talking to Michael alone, where I verified Diane's stories, where I showed up unannounced and found him alone and removed him to safety. In that timeline, Michael is 42 years old now. Maybe he's married. Maybe he has children. Maybe he works in Newark or moved away to somewhere quieter. Maybe he thinks about that social worker who visited when he was 4, the one who asked him questions and actually listened to his answers, the one who saved his life. But that's not this timeline. In this timeline, Michael is forever 4 years old, forever falling face first into creek water, forever dying alone while his mother sleeps and his social worker congratulates herself on another case closed efficiently. In this timeline, I'm the villain of his story, the person who had the power to save him and chose not to use it. I carry his death certificate not as penance, but as testimony. Testimony to the cost of certainty. Testimony to the necessity of doubt. Testimony to the truth that experience and expertise mean nothing if they make us stop questioning ourselves. The dinner bell just rang. In a few minutes, I'll walk down to the dining room and eat whatever they're serving tonight, probably something beige and overcooked, designed to be safe for people with no teeth and sensitive stomachs. I'll sit with the other residents and make small talk about the weather and our grandchildren and whether the TV room should show Jeopardy or Wheel of Fortune tonight. But first, I'll fold Michael's death certificate back up and tuck it into my purse. I'll run my fingers over the soft, worn paper one more time, and I'll whisper the same thing I whisper every time I touch it. I'm sorry I didn't save you, but I promise I learned from you. I promise your death meant something. I promise I spent the rest of my career making sure no other child died because their social worker was too proud to admit she might be wrong. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's all I have to offer. This story, this confession, this lesson learned too late for the child I couldn't save, but hopefully in time for all the children who came after him. That's the real tragedy of Michael Peterson's death. Not that it happened, but that it was so completely, entirely, devastatingly preventable. And the real tragedy of my life, that I had to let a child die before I learned to doubt myself.